So this is Disability and Political Science, current scholarship and future directions. I'm Annie Heffernan. I'm in a room with Monica Schneider. So just to say in the beginning, we're tethering to my phone. So if we drop out, we will do our best to get back on, but there's not actually a very good signal in the virtual rooms that they have at APSA. So that's a problem. But just to put that out there. So I think what we're going to do is sort of go around so we can get the most people talking as possible and get a good conversation going. We've just asked everybody to introduce themselves and a bit about their research in 5 minutes. And then we're going to have a few sort of guiding questions, but we really want to get a conversation going with participants and with panelists. So I think we're just going to go in alphabetical order to keep it simple because there are so many people. One thing to say is Lisa Schur said she might be a bit late. So she is joining, but might be here a little bit later. So Barbara, do you mind starting off?
No, not at all. So I'm Barbara Arneil. I'm a professor at the University of British Columbia. I was supposed to be in Montreal, but I have a cold. So if I start to hack, that's why. And I think I've had a long standing interest in disability going back to actually when I was working in government and working with disability advocates and organizations in Canada around what we were doing back in the mid-1990s, which was reforming the social policies in a federal system, and got to know a lot of organizations and started to think about it in some real depth. And when I took up the job at UBC, I realized that I really wanted to think about disability a lot more, and started to look for sessions and papers at APSA, and was really shocked to find there was just so little and so few. And I do remember very distinctly looking up, I think it was in Washington, DC, Nancy, and it was a long time ago. And the one paper that was on was Nancy's, and that had disability, at least in the title or in the abstract. And I went to the panel and I spoke to Nancy afterwards, and I said, we gotta do something about this. Like, well, how can we galvanize sort of more of a conversation around this? And that started a long process and a friendship between us, and eventually an co-edited book that came out, I think, about 4 or 5 years ago. And so, I continue to be really engaged in the questions. I like the 4 questions that were sent to us. I think COVID absolutely has caused us to be thinking about disability in a much more, it just adds a whole number of questions in my mind, including questions around increased vulnerability and equity and accommodation and so on. But also questions about science and relying on science and skepticism about science and so on. So I think that's probably good. Also, I guess just in terms of research, I'm a historian of political thought, so I'm interested in the history of disability, both in terms of how political thinkers in the canon think about it, especially in the liberal canon. But also more recently, I've been doing a lot of work on the idea of colonies for the disabled, beginning with Jeremy Bentham, which was a real surprise to me, was probably the first thinker that targeted the disabled for segregation into colonies within England in pauper panopticons. Anyways, I think that's enough. So that's me.
Jennifer, you're next. No, sorry.
Okay, so my name is Jennifer Erkulwater. I'm a professor at the University of Richmond. and I'm a scholar of American political development. I do most of my work on the US welfare state, and particularly Social Security. And so when I got started doing this kind of work, there was very little about the organizing of disability activists, and most of what is written about the US welfare state is about Social Security disability benefits policy. It focuses a lot on things that elites do, like Congress and judges and lawyers, and very little about the agency of actual people with disabilities. And so my research, at least right now, is focused on the intersection of race and disability. I'm really interested in thinking about how disability rights developed in conversation with, sometimes in opposition to welfare rights, and the kind of political organizing around those two kinds of movements, and thinking about the place of people of color within disability rights, when they get noticed, when they don't, what kind of voice they have, and how those two things kind of play out together. Thank you.
So I'm Annie Heffernan. I'm an assistant professor at University of Michigan. Like Barbara and Nancy, I'm a political theorist, mostly by training, but also sort of dabble in APD. And I think, like Barbara and Nancy, I came to sort of disability studies through feminist theory, but had been interested in it in college and kind of steered away from it by advisors, and sort of found a way back into it through feminist theory, and found a really good group of folks at U Chicago who were doing that work in interesting ways. So my research looks at ideas of citizenship and disability, so less sort of interrogating disability as exclusion from citizenship, than looking at the ways that concepts of disability sort of uphold ideas of citizenship. So primarily right now through ideas of work, but I'm hoping to expand that into other categories. Yeah, I think I'll leave it there, but I think it's been fun. Like, this is, I wish we were in person, but it's been fun to sort of do this over the last 2 years, getting together primarily Americanists and theorists, and hopefully in future. And that's one of the questions I wanted to ask later, but like, how do we expand it beyond Americanists and theorists to including the other subdisciplines in political science. So yeah, Nancy, you're up next.
Okay, I'm Nancy Hirschmann. I'm a professor also of political theory, political science at the University of Pennsylvania. Yes, Barbara, I think it was a panel on Rawls. It was that feminist interpretations of John Rawls, and I had written on justice versus freedom as a foundation for disability, and this was, or disability rights rather. And I've been struggling on a book about freedom and power, concepts of freedom and power, and how they manifest themselves for disability for quite a while now. And before the book Barbara and I did, I had done, but mostly been hanging out with people from other disciplines, historians, sociology of science, people in the English department. God, they're all over disability. And I'd organized an interdisciplinary conference at Penn. And so a book came out of that, that I co-edited with Beth Linker, called Civil Disabilities, Citizenship, Membership and Belonging. So again, I'm focused mostly on the concept of freedom, in terms of how it manifests itself in disability through the history of political thought, through contemporary thinking about the concept of freedom, through contemporary thinking about the concept of rights, and some other aspects of it. But lately, this summer, I've been thinking a lot about elder care. my mother had a stroke in June, and I spent the summer along the eastern end of North Shore, Long Island, taking care of her. And, it just struck me, we always, in an attempt to show how globally relevant disability is, so many of us say, look, we're all going to be disabled if we live long enough, as a way to include everybody. But then we say that, and then we move on, and we don't really do that much work on elder care or elder disability, because, as I've experienced this summer, the medical profession is basically, you're 93, you're pretty much close to death anyhow, so what's the point? As a result, a lot of suffering happens in the interim. You don't just die like that unless you're fortunate enough to live in a state where they have right to die laws. So part of my concern is sort of, you got, you younger, look, I mean, the vast majority of disability political theorists and political scientists are younger generation, and you're the future, right? If this panel is supposed to be about the future, you're the future, because you guys are focused almost exclusively on disability issues, whereas people like Barbara and I have been publishing on a bunch of different things and writing on different things, and we're bringing disability, into our work rather later in the game. But I also think that, it's people of our generation who are going to be facing these questions in 10 and 20 years. And the picture is not pretty, I have to tell you. And if we're not going to think about it, who is? So I want that to be part of the future of disability studies, or the present of disability studies. We need to start thinking about that throwaway line about how, well, if we all live old enough, eventually we'll all become disabled. So.
Andy, you're next. Or Andrew.
Hi, everyone. I'm Andy Jenks. I publish under Andrew, so that's why it's in my Zoom title. I'm trying to think about how to move on from what Nancy just said. That's really difficult and heavy to kind of think about. I currently work as an educational assessment specialist at the University of Delaware in the Center for Teaching and Assessment of Learning. My day job is sometimes related to disability, I would say. I have, had a strong interest very early on, not only from experiences, right, as someone from a younger generation who grew up with the protections of the ADA and current iterations of IDEA, in the classroom, kind of informing my disability rights consciousness, I guess. And then I guess that consciousness was activated when reading John Rawls. It always kind of returns to John Rawls, doesn't it? In a first year seminar, normative theory in 2013. Since then, I've really approached disability, and I kind of had a non-traditional PhD program where, well, I guess like many folks who study disability, you don't really have anyone who's an expert in disability at your university, right? So many of the people in this room or on this panel, Nancy, I invited to give a talk in my third year of grad school. Jennifer was a reader on my committee. I was looking to Annie's master's thesis as I was writing my own. So kind of searching out and finding folks who do this work, right? It's amazing that this panel is taking place today, because the first time I attended APSA, it didn't. And I think that there's, a lot that can be done, but the question is, what can we do to kind of signify the importance of disability to our peers within the profession? That could be through research, that could be through teaching and discussions about teaching, but more generally, right, how can we support and encourage those who have disabilities, right? People who I saw walking around, right, the conference earlier today, who are visibly disabled or discernibly disabled, who aren't here right now. Right, where are those people? How can we get those people involved? How can we recruit undergraduate and graduate students into doing disability within political science? Are really big questions I'm interested in. And then also, how can what we know and what we've learned, what we write about, what we talk about, influence how not only political science is taught, but also university teaching in general? it's amazing that there's so much critical and literary study of disability within the United States. There's so much study of disability that happens within the social sciences and politics and social policy scholars outside of the United States. How can we combine forces for good, I would say, as we move forward?
April? Sorry for just like going, but I figure getting everybody to talk and then we can sort of open it up.
I'm April Johnson. I'm an associate professor at Kennesaw State University, which is just outside of Atlanta. Honestly, in hearing everybody's background, I just feel like very new to the subject of disability politics. I don't necessarily have the theoretical kind of like background that it seems like a lot of you have. So I came to study disability politics several years ago. I've published with Sierra Powell, who's at Mount San Antonio College in California. And she and I met at the Western Conference one year, and she was doing disability politics and I was doing kind of like mental health and how mental health influences political participation. So we kind of met and then started collaborating, and we've, published some things on disability. And I have a background in psychology, but kind of parlayed that into political psychology. So really what I study is just sort of why people do what they do in terms of political behavior, attitudes, participation, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, it's been really great and really eye-opening working with Sierra. But I think now she's kind of had to step away a little bit from the research aspect. So now I'm sort of branching out on my own, I guess I would say. And at our Thursday panel that Stefanie was a part of, I presented some work on sort of attitudes among the disabled community in terms of like their attitudes towards economics, economic preferences. So yeah, I think probably I would say my main thrust in terms of the disability politics is learning why people do what they do, have the attitudes, but also I think it's, for me personally, like less of the theory and more of like the data aspect, trying to get better data so that we can study more of these different sort of aspects of disability politics. So Sierra and I had like an ANES pilot data where we actually got to put some questions, like specific disability questions, not just the employment measure. So that's kind of where I'm at in terms of my area of research and focus, and kind of more of like the empirical studying of disability. I think that, yeah.
Stefanie?
Yeah, hi everyone. My name is Stefanie Reher. I'm a what we call senior lecturer or associate professor at the University of Strathclyde in Scotland. I'm an empirical political scientist as well, like April, what you would probably call an Americanist, except I focus on Europe mostly, but also a bit the US. Mostly using quantitative methods, including survey data and survey experiments more recently as well. So I'm interested in all the stages of the representation process. So from voter participation, the role of disability in participation and voter attitudes, to access to parties and elected office of disabled people. And here I'm particularly interested also in voter perceptions of disabled candidates, and also the question of whether and how disabled politicians, once they're in office, actually represent disabled citizens. So as I said, a particular focus over the last couple of years and also going forward in my work has been on how voters perceive disabled candidates. Do they stereotype? Do they kind of discriminate against them at the ballot box? So far, my results have been fairly encouraging, just as a side note. and also how candidates can frame and do frame the disability to affect and kind of steer and shape public perceptions. I'm working on a book manuscript together with Elizabeth Evans at Goldsmiths University of London, who's unfortunately not here. I don't see her in the Zoom room. She couldn't make it to APSA, unfortunately, because she got ill. But we use a mixed methods approach in the book. So some chapters are more quantitative, some more qualitative. We have a theoretical chapter as well, but generally, it's more of an empirical book. Basically, again, tracing the whole representation process from asking who is allowed to participate in the first place, going all the way to access to elected office, and how do disabled representatives draw on their lived experience, for instance, to represent disabled citizens. We focus primarily on the UK in the book, but also try to broaden it up a little bit. And we draw on different kinds of data. So we have about 80 interviews with disabled former and present candidates, MPs, and so on. We look at party manifestos, survey data, survey experiments, and so on. So hopefully that's going to come out in the near future. I'm also part of the diversity committee of the European Political Science Association since a couple of years ago. And there I've been, together with a couple of other people, been trying to really raise awareness for not just disability as a kind of a topic, a substantive topic in political science, but also the accessibility of the discipline and academia more generally. So we've EPSA, EPSA, the conference, has been organizing these diversity sessions every year, looking at or having sessions on a number of different topics, and we've been having one on navigating disability in academia, which has been extremely interesting. We've not had too many people participate because I guess we are quite underrepresented in political science as well, but yeah, it's still been extremely interesting, and I think very useful for those of us who have been participating. So I don't know if something like that would be, something to do at APSA as well. Yeah, finally, I just want to say, kind of going forward in this discussion, I think one of the main things I want to focus on is also the experience of having difficulty of getting data, especially on political representatives. So we ask about disability in a lot of voter surveys now, but we don't ask that much in representative surveys yet, and we rely, and neither do political institutions, parties, and parliaments, right? And that just makes it really, really difficult to actually kind of name and identify underrepresentation and actually ask where does it happen and how can we tackle it. Thanks.
And Lisa, we're just going around to introduce ourselves. So, and give like a brief 5-minute sort of spiel on our research. So thank you we're so glad you were able to get in.
Thank you. I apologize for being late. I was
No. There were a number of glitches. That...
Yeah. Well, it's great to see everyone. I'm really happy to be here. As some of you know, I've been studying disability for a long time, since the 1990s. I just want to say that I'm so glad that this is happening at APSA, because when I first started and tried to submit articles, I would routinely get rejected, and I would get rejects that would say, this is too niche a topic for political science, and maybe you should submit to a rehabilitation journal. And I got that message a number of times. So I just want to say I've been working with colleagues on voting and political participation, and also on other forms of political participation for a long time. And I think the field is starting to recognize how important this is. Not only is people with disabilities make up a very large and growing demographic group, but also when you look at the factors that affect participation among people with disabilities, you can draw broader lessons, I think, about marginalized groups in society and the factors that inhibit or motivate them to participate. Things like resources. People with disabilities, are employed at lower rates, they make less money, they have lower education levels, something we've looked at a lot. And I think an important point is the social isolation that a lot of people with disabilities face that we've also been looking at. They are less likely to have contact with friends, family members, other people who can recruit them for voting and other types of political participation. They socialize less, they're less likely to be employed. So I just want to say, how can there be more scholarship on people with disabilities? And people, I might be repeating what people have already said, but one barrier, which is pretty obvious, is just the lack of people who self-identify as having disabilities in higher education in general and in PhD political science programs. And I think that needs to be addressed. We need to reach out and specifically target people who feel comfortable studying and talking about disability. And we need to take it more seriously. The other thing I was just hearing, I think it was Stefanie, was just talking about lack of data, and that also needs to be addressed. There's really such a lack. The American National Election Survey does not have a good disability measure. The only measure is one that people volunteer as a reason why they're not working. That is a major problem for so many reasons. Also, election polls, including election night exit surveys, do not ask people whether they, any type of disability questions. So very little attention is paid to people with disabilities as an important group in election outcomes. And even though people with disabilities can clearly make a difference, especially in close elections, and as we're expecting some elections to be very close, I think we need to pay more attention to that. So those are just a few thoughts that I have. Be happy to go talk more, but since we have a lot of participants, I will turn it over now. So thanks.
Sorry, thank you. Monica, do you wanna?
Yeah, sure. My name is Monica Schneider. I'm a professor of political science at Miami University, which is in Ohio. I'm a political psychologist by training, and primarily my career has been on stereotypes and gender, and some racial stereotypes, but primarily gender. So I'm interested in disability bias. I'm interested in public opinion towards disability politics and policy. I have some data right now that's coming up in the pipeline to be published about disability bias in COVID-19. And I'm also, like Nancy mentioned at the outset, very interested in care work and how people interact with the state on disability policy, and what are those sort of interest groups and social groups that can even facilitate those interactions with state policies.
All right. So I think now sorry. Don't do that. Sorry, we're in this like tiny little room upstairs that's not very great, and that's why there is one light that is just like directly over my head. So we've prepared some questions just to get the conversation going, and I had everybody kind of contribute sort of areas that they thought, you know, would be good to focus on, and I've put them into 4 questions, but that's just to sort of get the conversation going. So the first area I thought we'd focus on is sort of, sorry, I said the relationship between disability studies and political science. So while political science has not given a whole, I mean, with the exception of a lot of the people on this panel, given a lot of thought to disability, there's, you know, an entire field of disability studies. And I think one of the questions that a lot of panelists posed was, how do we both facilitate connections with disability studies so we're not reinventing the wheel and doing work that's already been being done and just pitching it to a new audience? How do we sort of facilitate those conversations? How do we engage with disability studies? How do we get more people in political science to, you know, be invested in disability as a topic of inquiry, as sort of in all areas? So one of the things I mentioned earlier is it's been very hard to find comparativists or IR scholars. We did have a grad student who applied to Michigan, who is at Berkeley now. So she's a comparativist. but is very early in the program. So, but we had talked about like what work is out there. And I couldn't really point her in any direction. So how do we get more people invested in the topic? How do we meaningfully engage with disability studies? So there's cross-pollination between the two fields. So that's just sort of to start us off.
Someone can answer.
Yes.
I'll always think of something to say if no one does.
Yeah.
Do you want us to raise our hands or just jump in?
Yeah.
You can just jump in.
All right,
The dog can
That's
jump
my
in.
dog. Okay. Then I'll do that. Well, I just wanted, one thing I was thinking about was, you know, I'll let others talk about disability studies because I think they know it better, but I think there's such a possibility in international relations, and I'm not quite sure why it hasn't taken off. Because there is such a accumulated knowledge and practice, you know, around the Convention on the Rights of, you know, people with disabilities, and just the whole movement, the international movement around disability. And there's a lot of Canadians actually at the forefront of that and have been for many, many years. So I guess what I'm wondering, and I'm thinking here about a colleague of mine, Cheryl Lightfoot, who is one of the very few Indigenous political IR scholars who really focuses on the, you know, similar kind of thing is around the international rights of disabled persons, but it's very small, you know, but growing. So I don't know, I don't have much to, just a question mark about that, the gap between sort of the practice, the international practice, which I think is robust, versus the scholarship around the international. And I actually, you know, I wrote a paper a few years ago, I think actually it was in our book, Nancy, around how the international practice is kind of pushing the scholarship and certainly political theorists. So anyway, so it's one of the questions I have is on the comparative side is one thing, but I think IR, there might be a possibility there. So that was kind of one of my comments.
Right, but the question is, how do we get the IR scholars to read the work in disability studies? And one of the things about disability studies is that it is so heavily humanist, right? It's really dominated by people in English, for instance, as well as historians who tell, you know, very deep, but very, you know, narrow stories about like particular individual lives or particular geographical locations or particular periods, particular incidents like the smallpox epidemics, and so it's sometimes difficult for political scientists who, especially political theorists who want to look at, you know, big grand questions, to engage with that scholarship, because it seems, you know, I mean, unless we're Foucault, you know, we'd have to put together all these different little pieces to put together some grand theory. And I'm no Foucault, so I'm not really, I'm a little intimidated by about doing that. But also just, you know, the reason I even got interested in the idea of freedom was one of the first Society for Disability Studies conferences I went to. The theme was, you know, beyond disability rights to justice. And I'm like, what? You know, getting what, and they were using these terms in ways that were like, you know, would make a political theorist head, but just making my head spin as a political theorist. I was like, no, you guys don't understand what concepts you're talking about. And so I think that's something that we have to contribute to disability studies. But the problem is they are often, you know, they think they know what it is, because everyone throws around terms like rights and justice and freedom. So everyone thinks they know what it means. And so being able to make that sort of communication has been really hard, because you have to establish the cred. You have to establish the credentials and the credibility, and doing it in a different discipline, it's sort of a circular problem. And so I, you know, for a while I was just hanging out with people in these other disciplines, and then I realized, you know, this is crazy. I got to go back to political science and just sort of, do what we did 30 years ago or 40 years ago with feminism and just say, look, beat down the doors. You guys have to pay attention to this. And so the work that we're doing, I think, is very reminiscent of what feminist political scientists were doing back in the 80s. Certainly pointing to work and using work and drawing on work in disability studies from other disciplines. I do that quite a lot, especially with philosophers. I love to poke fun at the philosophers. But being able to find the work that political scientists can say, oh, okay, I can see the relevance of this piece of work to my own project, becomes a real challenge, because some of it is so just very humanistic that a lot of times political scientists are just going to say, this is not a discourse for me. And so part of it is a disciplinary issue, I think.
I'd like to add on really quickly with an anecdote. I know that that's everyone's favorite thing to do at a conference, but I remember attending a talk in 2015 or 14, something like that, and as kind of a newer graduate student, asked the presenter, who's a name in disability studies in the United States but not in political science, about their methods, and they kind of laughed the question off, right, or shrugged the question off. And I think that kind of nonchalance and that attitude towards kind of formalizing the work, right? And I know that there's always this tension between defining the work in your own terms and defining it on other people's terms, right? That needs to be done, and that balance needs to be struck. But at the same time, like I feel like there's certainly a lot of disability studies scholarship out there, specifically that comes, from kind of the U.S. dominant side that is methodologically not the kind of work that we want to be supporting and saying, look at these 5 examples of disability studies scholarship. This is why you should pay attention to that. I think that's another tension that we're kind of pulling out here. It's not necessarily this kind of connects to Nancy's, trying to connect to Nancy's point, is that we're not talking only about kind of anything related to disability, but we're talking specifically about disabilities, work that works at the intersection of disability studies and political science, which speaks to broader audiences in this questions of really making sure that disability is represented within the discipline.
So can I wanted to chime in and build on what Andy and Nancy said. Simi Litton has this piece, I forget the full title, but the term "not disability studies" is in it, and she uses it to kind of cleave all the things that are written about disability into what is disability studies and what is not disability studies. Mm-hmm. And one of the points that she makes is that there's something wrong with empiricism because it objectifies people with disabilities. It creates a distance between the researcher and then them. And I think that that's a really big divide for political scientists who are trained as positivists. And I think that makes it really difficult for us to speak the same language. And at least for me, there's a tiny sliver of maybe critical disability studies, which does speak openly about systems and power, which sounds like my language that I feel like I can get an entree into. But I think Nancy's right that so much of it just seems so different from what we do.
I think that's a really important point. And I think that's an issue we need to wrestle with, because I'm not ready to throw out empiricism, right? At the same time, I think this approach has been historically used to alienate and separate what is scholarship from people with disabilities whose experiences have been discounted, if not outright ignored. So I think this is the crucial tension. And I think we can overcome this, but I think we have to be very careful. And maybe we have to challenge to some extent the traditional methodology in political science. I'm not saying throw it out, but I'm saying like question it. what is the function of this? What is it doing? Is it inclusive? How can we make it more inclusive without being completely quote unquote subjective? So just wanted to say I totally agree with you.
This might be a good point to sort of transition to a very similar question, which is just the lack of data that we have. So that was one of the things that a number of comments highlighted. And I think just the need to get better data with the exceptions that have just been voiced, because I think in disability studies, you know, there's a common thing to say like 20% of people are disabled, but of course, not all 20% of those people are going to identify as disabled, and getting some clarity on who identifies as disabled, what populations are we talking about, how do we sort of disaggregate, and again, I'm a theorist, so I'm probably going to totally butcher this, but like, how do we disaggregate sort of administrative definitions of disability from political definitions of disability, from like sort of how do we collect this data? What are the best ways to collect it? I mean, Monica, you could probably articulate this better than I can. But I think it is really true, even for theorists, to even begin to say like, who is this for? How do we get attention to sort of disability as an object of inquiry, that I think isn't just of interest to sort of quantitative scholars.
I just wanted to pick up on something I think Lisa was just talking about on, you know, the and Jennifer, the gap between, from a positivist or empiricist perspective, and what that does to data. And one of the things I wrote about here in Canada was Stats Canada in the census changed in response to the International Convention on the Rights of People with Disability and the definition of disability, which was very interdependent, right? That involved both environment and health functioning. And what they did was they changed from what had been what was called a health and activity survey to a participation and activity survey. And I think in some ways, I think the way we collect data, if it responds to disability advocates and disabilities changing understanding, this is, I'm talking, you know, 20 years ago, this was done, where it's not just focusing on, oh, what is the cause of the impairment, but rather, how are you prevented from participating in society? What are the barriers? And that's the kind of data you're collecting. And so to me, it's a question of, what is the data? Who are setting the categories? And does it respond to disabled persons, people with disabilities, and advocacy and organizations who are trying to redefine what disability is, you know, away from the medical model and more to an interactive model.
And I would like to just follow up on that point, on Barbara's point, that I think people who study anything related to disability really need to be pressuring, I guess that's the right word, pressuring these like kind of survey organizations to include additional measures. You know, political scientists, we love our surveys. We love our nationally representative surveys. But to be quite honest, I mean, it is a very lazy way to gather your data. I think when it comes to disability communities, that we need, you know, obviously better measures, but that means more kind of in-depth measures. It means reaching out to those people who are not, you know, probably going to be surveyed, or like they would need additional assistance in order to be surveyed. So I think, you know, we need to like just recognize first and foremost, if we want these survey measures, like you're going to have to do a little bit more work than you would with just, you know, like any survey respondent, that you need to specifically target disability communities and understand like the disabilities that might impact their ability to respond to a survey and kind of work around that and just be more, I guess, detailed and in depth and almost, I don't want to say like a case study, but yeah, like just kind of more targeted kind of data collection measures from these large survey organizations?
I think one of the difficult points here relates to the difference which constitutes the disability category. There's a perception that's created by some of the scholarship within the field, Don Kulik and Ridstrom's Loneliness and Its Opposite, right, is a study of people with severe intellectual disability, right? And severe disability versus moderate disability versus mild disability is meaningful categories, right? And those are meaningful categories and characteristics and differences, right? If we're talking about the empirics of studying disability, it kind of all comes under this big umbrella that is so diverse, right? And it's something that I think that we, while we still want to say there needs to be place for disability, right? I'm oftentimes worried about how careful or not careful a survey organization might be kind of in implementing, right, some of those questions, right, in a national survey, something like that.
Yeah, and just picking up on what you just said, money is a factor too, right? Because the more questions you ask, the more expensive the survey is going to be. I know this is really crass, but it's true, right? But I think also these survey companies do not recognize the fluidity of the characteristics of disability. That's one of the people can move in and out of having a disability. For one thing, sometimes you can have a disability, sometimes you don't. Anyone can develop a disability at any time. And also, I just wanted to point out the chronic undercount in surveys like CPS, where things like depression or chronic pain are not counted. They don't ask any kind of questions about that. So many, or even conditions like having cancer. So a lot of people might not, it's not that they would refuse to identify as having a disability, they're not even asked about this kind of thing, or what impact does this have on your life? So I think there has to be a different focus. I'm kind of ranting here, so I'll stop. But I agree with what you're saying. We need to be much more careful.
I briefly addressed earlier that I'm particularly interested in getting better data on political elites. And I think that the crucial thing is that we have to rely on self-identification, right? I mean, this is obviously a discussion that I think we need to have and that we need to engage in. And how do we actually measure disability, right? How do we measure, or do we measure impairment? Do we measure disability identity? Do we measure all of them? Because I think also the relationships between them are extremely important, both among citizens, but also among elites. And I think there is no way around having better survey data amongst political elites. In the UK, for instance, in the candidate survey, they did ask about whether candidates identified as disabled, and quite a few people responded. Not everyone did, but quite a few people did, both yes and no. And that data is extremely useful. And I know a couple of other countries are also doing it, but I think there's also great resistance to it. So Mikko Mattila and I tried to get a disability question into the comparative candidate survey, and they didn't want to do it, and they thought it was too sensitive. And I think a lot of that is just the stigma, right? That a lot of people running these surveys think that disability, that identifying as disabled is something bad, and that being identified by others, potentially, if it's de-anonymized as disabled, is also something bad. And I think from speaking to a lot of disabled representatives and candidates, we've seen that that's not the case. They're very, very happy to talk about it. They see the need for better data in order to actually, study how and why underrepresentation happens and how representation happens. But I think what's also really, or what's even trickier perhaps even, is that it's not just representative self-identification and how that influences their actions and so on, but also how voters perceive them, right? So a lot of representatives might have hidden disabilities, but voters might not know unless they talk about it, right? Or they might have visible impairments, but might not identify as disabled, but voters might see them as disabled. So I think that's a whole other kind of issue around measurement, where it could be really, really fruitful to talk to scholars of other marginalized groups as well, like representatives of color, for instance, LGBTQ representatives, and how they navigate those issues.
Some of the same questions come up with gender identity as well, right? Like the way you feel about your gender may be different than how you present yourself, which could also be different than how people perceive you. And all of those, I mean, there's a lot of theorizing about gender identity that could be relevant to think about disability identity here. And then I would just to throw in about, data, I do think there's a way in which we need public opinion data towards thinking about attitudes towards some of these policies that affect disabled people. And I think, and also try to understand, there's been a couple of key works in political science recently about really understanding how people interact with the state and with the system. And I think understanding that better for disability policies, including things like IDEA, or and how people experience those administrative burdens, could also be really beneficial. So I don't think we fully understand what people think about these policies in ways that could affect the outcomes.
Any last?
I just want to say one thing on the self-identification question. At UBC, we have changed the way in which we collect data on people who we are hiring. And I think it's been absolutely the most powerful thing we've done in terms of increasing diversity, including disability, but other underrepresented groups. And so what we do is when people apply to a job, they are asked simultaneously to indicate across gender identity, sexual identity, disability, racialized group, Indigenous, and so on. And so that is collected and that is shared with us without actually identifying those people. So we know, okay, so we can track as we go through long list, short list, is there some sort of bias that's being created here? One. Then two, they're asked, are you willing to share this information? And it's each category with the search committee. And so some people will say, yes, I'll share disability, but I don't want to share my sexual orientation and so on. They get the choice as to how much they want to share. And the last thing we did was people had to opt out rather than opt into this. And so it means that we had about 70% of the candidates, we had a really good sense of the degree to which they would contribute to the diversification of our department, on top of whether they substantively then study race, gender, and disability, and so on, which you can see obviously from their file. And I actually think that's very powerful because the two sides of sort of diversity and representation, one is actually what we've talked about, are there people actually in the field? And can we identify them and how do we do that? But how do we also protect their privacy? And at the same time, substantively, are they contributing through their research, which is a separate question. So I don't know what other universities do, but I do think that's really important way. We need to figure out this way of how to identify folks in a way that protects their privacy, but also allows them to share information with the committee.
If I have a comment, should I just jump in? Can you hear me? Okay, my internet connection was bad before. Perhaps my comment fits to the previous question. Apologies for that. So I just want to say, so I haven't been doing this topic very long. I actually come from and still am in comparative government, and actually do things like comparative federalism, multi-level governance, institutions. But I started working a little bit on the side, and wrote an article about challenges to democracy, conventional democracy, on account of cognitive impairment. And the funny and sad thing was I had the same experience. Political science journalists didn't even put it out to review, so I didn't even get the chance to see, was this a good article or not, which is why I contacted then, this was 2016, Deborah O'Connor, who I think is at UBC as well, but comes from a much different department. Because the thing is, when you start looking at disability studies and even nursing studies articles, I mean, there are people doing such fascinating things, also dealing with power issues and asymmetries, where I thought, why isn't this not a topic? Like in political science, also that whether it's not just theory, I heard about, IR, this is a big issue. Are there any sort of diffusion effects because of the UN convention? In Germany, we saw this with the Constitutional Court actually passed a recent, there used to be a categorical exclusion from active and passive voting rights if you had a certain degree of cognitive impairment. And the German Constitutional Court just recently, 2 years ago, said that was not compatible with the Constitution, but the basis was on the UN Convention. So there are interesting things happen also from an IR perspective, and I think also from comparative government. I'm going that way, and I'm certainly open for any sort of collaboration, because I think we also, I don't really have a question, I guess, for what it's worth. I wanted to say that, so there would be one comparative government guy who's interested, whether I'm good at it or not, but I'm certainly interested.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you. So one other, sorry, I'm trying to toggle between my phone and my laptop. So the other question I had, or sort of to the group, is and this has been brought up a lot, it's a commonplace to say that everyone will become disabled if they live long enough. And while this is true, several scholars and activists have questioned whether locating old age, infancy, and other forms of illness on the spectrum of ability sort of either dilutes the concept of disability or misidentifies kind of areas that we already, and again, this is debatable, have accepted in some way. Like, is there a risk to that? But how do we also, I think, especially in the wake of COVID-19, or whatever, we're not quite in the wake, we're in the middle of it. But how do we sort of acknowledge these, whether it's other categories or account for sort of this passing in and out of disability or old age or post-COVID or toxic harm, whatever you want to add under that category? Like, how do we meaningfully engage with that work? Like, where does the definition of sorry, this is very poorly worded, come in here? You're okay.
Yeah. Well, I could start off by saying old age is not a disability, but old age often brings disabilities. I mean, before the pandemic, my mother was a vibrant 90-year-old. She worked until she was 3 months before her 90th birthday as a librarian. Okay, so the pandemic, a year later, she was a little old lady who had, mild disability. She's beginnings of dementia. A year later, she's completely disabled. She uses a wheelchair. She's lost mobility. I mean, so there's it's an issue of the disability is not the age. It is the fact that when you're older, you become more likely to experience disabilities. So I think that's important to keep that in mind. That even though older people are more vulnerable and more likely to experience disabilities, that old age itself is not a disability.
If I could add, because that's one issue that I'm currently grappling with, disability, vulnerability, and dependence. What is the relationship between these categories? Is it disability in some form of, right, this is an original, but we all begin with dependency, and the likelihood is high that at some point, whether in and out, acute or chronically, or at latest in old age, some sort of dependency is likely to occur. And what was the relationship between these different categories or terms? That's I'm just resonating that I find that very in order to deal with. and highly relevant. Do you take a more fluid sense, but does that do injustice to people who have a certain degree of disability or not? Should we go in the direction of, I think it's Martha Feynman with the vulnerability theory, that essentially that's the universal human condition that we need to accept? I'm sympathetic to that, but again, as somebody who's not an expert, I don't have a place there, don't have an answer to that either, but I just want to underline, I find that highly, highly relevant and interesting and important. Thanks.
Yeah, Teresa? Teresa, I think,
Can you hear me?
yes, yes.
Can you see me? I'd like to respond to that question, but also can I say something more general and with, based on what I'm hearing? Or should I wait till the end when it is open?
Sorry. Any of the participants and the audience members can go ahead to.
Okay, thank you. So first of all, I should identify myself as a disabled person. I have a speech disability among many other disabilities that I have. So this is about as clear as I can speak, but I can also suddenly stall and that my tongue will freeze up. So that's sort of, it's a way for me to, I think, bring to the discussion that since the WHO moved, so we say, the whole understanding of disability and impairment from a medical model to a social model, and as is noted before, that it really, that whole way of thinking about disability is about not just your physical constraint, but the environment within which you interact. And when certain impairment becomes pertinent and when others become not relevant. So in my case, for example, then, I developed my speech disability as part of, and I don't mind saying this, as part of a whole host of issues generated by radiation treatment when I was a young person in graduate school. And at that time, in the early 2000s, I'm in Canada, I guess the only other Canadian in this group. I'm at the University of Guelph, which is just about an hour away west of Toronto. So at that time, because of the nature of my disability is caused by nerve palsy of the tongue, my oncologist wrote to the university and said that her disability is such that she can no longer speak to a big group, and that it's okay for her to speak like I am now. In other words, a room small enough that I don't have to exaggerate my speech with or without microphone. And that was before we were unionized, and I didn't have a very supportive faculty association. I had to get my own lawyer without a workplace accommodation plan. And while I was struggling with all this, the big problem is big classroom. And in Canada, our public system is just overloaded. And for someone who is relatively junior to not be able to teach a big class, you're done. Unfortunately, I had this disability after I got tenure. So it dawned on me that when we were negotiating, I asked my older brother, who is a philosopher teaching in a very well-endowed private college in the States. So it dawned on me, I said, have you ever taught a class with more than 30 people? He said, not even 30, 20 at most. Then dawned on me that, if I were in that situation, I wouldn't even have to disclose my disability. I would just continue to teach. At most, I just have to tell students, which I do, that I have a speech disability, but it wouldn't become an issue that requires legal protection in that sense. And that sort of brings me then to, I sent you an email with my first ever publication on disability, which came out in 2006. And it's a book called Critical Disability Theory, edited by two law professors at the Howard University. I contributed as, I think, the only person serious, and it's based on my personal experience in negotiating workplace accommodation, but the piece is actually really about multicultural citizenship. And those were the days when, based on my research at the time, certainly in the States, I think there was some expression among disabled activists that disabled individuals should be considered a minority group in the same way as other racial minorities should be considered. And interestingly, Will Timothy had at that time made a short comment about specifically about the deaf community, which happens to indeed have its own language. So the piece, as I wrote it then, turned into a piece about, from my angle, it is about intersectionality. It is about me being a woman of visible minority background, whose mother tongue is not English, and now compounded by a disability that is not visible, speech disability, and how that can then turn into, and I've experienced that you can't speak properly, not because of the disability, but because of who you are as a racial minority who speaks with an accent. So I think there's really a lot about how disability works in real life that we as political theorists, as political scientists can work on, precisely because a lot of it really has to do with power dynamics. And so that sort of brings me up to where I am now, and I've contributed to the volume that Nancy and Barbara have edited. So right now I'm sort of interested in working in the sort of mental disorder from a sort of more philosophical point of view, but also having a fit in the more sort of empirical based research on disability. Right now, I am part of a big research group at my university, interdisciplinary. And the idea is to move beyond employment to understand the problem faced by disabled individuals. As we all know, disabled individuals all over the world have a much higher rate of unemployment than the average population. And so we use the concept of livelihood, and I have certainly benefited from a lot of empirical research done by other colleagues in the field. And so I guess what I'm trying to say is then that given how little political science has done, and I still remember back after I got that chapter read in 2005, it came out 2006. I remember going to the APSA and ask around if people I know, and no one said I know anyone who's working on disability studies, and I'm not a very, I guess, very still in making connections. So I just kind of, put it on the side after I finished that book chapter. So I guess now what I'm trying to point out is that I think it's given how little we know about disability, what little we have studied, I think it would be enormously beneficial that we reach out to other colleagues who have done that work, and that, for example, like I said, then at least one of the social admins, and there's a push to think beyond that poverty is a chronic condition faced by disabled individuals. And like I said, I've always wondered, if I were disabled before I got tenure, would I ever be hired and now have the security of a job? So I think this livelihood concept, and I've published or jointly published a piece on this, and that I think that those are the ways for us to sort of open up our mind and enrich, or try to enrich what little we have in thinking about the reality of disability. So thanks for listening.
Thank you. Yeah, I think just picking up on that, one of the limits that really comes across like is a lot of grad students with disabilities either have to take leave from their programs. So that there are a number of grad students I've worked with that are no longer in the program because this is not a profession that is conducive to having a disability. I mean, at Michigan, we do finally have like a disability office for faculty because everything was through the students. Haven't seen how successful that's going to be. We'll see whether it actually works, but I think there is, particularly as someone who's junior, a nervousness about kind of, I mean, my disability is visible, so I don't get a whole lot of choice around things, but like a nervousness about acknowledging the limitations of that for my research, for production. I think I'm lucky right now in that, you know, the chair of my department has a disabled son, so is very aware of these issues. But I think just in terms of like basic limitations to getting people with disabilities into the profession is, and I think this is true for, you know, if you look even within disability studies, the majority of people who are the most productive are not like seriously disabled. And so, and again, there's dangers of using that categorization, but I think it is true that academia in general, and this isn't just political science, is not a friendly environment to taking breaks.
Andy, I want to pick up. Oh, sorry.
You go ahead, Andy, and I'll go ahead.
Okay. I just really quickly want to pick up on that. Like that's what you just said, you know, it's the reality of the situation, right? I've done some empirical work related to people with blindness, visual impairment getting jobs, you know, and outside of being employed in a blind related industry, right? People were getting jobs or getting educational opportunities or able to complete college degrees because there had been a blind person before and someone else, you know, it was like, okay, someone else can do this, or we know a disabled person who can do this, right? And that still falls into this kind of like pity model of disability, you know, and I think that another thing that I'm thinking as I'm listening to this, I really appreciated, Teresa, you sharing that story, because it's kind of like part of the unwritten history of disability within political science, right? That's not in anyone's textbook or anyone's articles anywhere. Is that, you know, the study of disability, especially within the university, or the money that goes towards the study of disability within the university, is almost, you know, solely focused on the study of children and or adults with intellectual disability at these centers for disabilities studies, right? That exist, this network across the country. And I think that that's something that we have to grapple with, right? And thinking about where impairment plays, you know, it plays into this, right? And I think that point, Annie, that you raised about productivity and impairment, and we all know, right? Because we're here and we study this and we're so interested in this, is that when you're disabled, everything takes longer and it doesn't matter what it is, right? So you still have to work harder just to get to the same result. And I think that's a really important fact that we kind of have to grapple with. Sorry to derail that, Barbara.
No, not at all. Actually, what I wanted to say was going back to the question about, this idea of the universality of disability versus the specificity of disability as a category that people live with their entire life and grapple with. And Teresa, hi, it's great to see you. And Andy, the lived experience of disability is so important. I mean, it's the nothing about us without us, right? Kind of mantra, I think, is really critical to center. And I'm, in some ways, I'm thinking about, I don't know how many of you read this article, those of you who are political theorists, about decolonizing political theory by Karuna Montana and Adam Getachew. But basically, they're arguing that to talk about colonialism or imperialism, you need to center colonized folks, right? And I think in the same way with disability, we need to center disabled scholars and the lived experience of those disabled scholars. Having said that, I also am with Nancy. 10 minutes before this call, I got a text from my siblings saying, my mother had fallen overnight in her care home. They don't know what's going on. She won't go in an ambulance. I'm waiting to get texts. It's kind of that lived reality of us boomers, I guess. How elderly care, especially congregate elderly care. I mean, that's one of the things that COVID has really revealed in this country, I'm sure in the US, is just how many people died, older people died in care homes without, and how bad the care is, actually, care. We can put in quotation marks in many cases. So I think that, but I think we can hold both things together. I don't think we have to give up one without the other. And I think I'm with Nancy that speaking to the specificity of elder care, especially when it's in congregate, is important to speak to at the same time, and that is universal experience often if you live long enough, but at the same time without losing the nothing about us without us as well. So I think it's possible. I think it's rich. In fact, there's a richness in the tension between those things. So I think we can do both, is what I'm saying. And I am also very encouraged by a younger generation. Yay, because I think you guys are rocking it. So Nancy and I can shuffle off and others, many others. But I think that there's people that are focusing on this almost entirely is a very, very welcome sign.
Barbara, you have to stay.
Can I?
Go ahead.
Yeah. No, I just want to quickly say, and I kind of, agree with a lot of things that have been said. When we think about disability and COVID, I think there are kind of two things. One is how a lot of disabled people were kind of forgotten, right? Deprioritized, basically, like the ableism, disableism just like really came out. At the same time, it's this narrative of a lot of people get long COVID, so kind of non-disabled, like normal people now have to deal with these issues. So suddenly everyone, a lot of people care about these issues that a lot of us have been struggling with for our whole lives. And I feel like I see that sometimes in political science, like when we try to encourage people who don't study disability and people who aren't disabled themselves to be interested in the topic and like convincing them that it matters and trying to get our articles into mainstream political science journals, is to say, well, we all might be disabled one day, and COVID is disabling a lot of us. And while I do think that's obviously really important, right? I don't want to kind of negate that experience of anyone at all. At the same time, I think we also need to make sure that we still value and recognize the experience of people who have been disabled their whole lives or from a young age, who have experienced ableism throughout their career, something that Teresa mentioned. If you're disabled going into your career, that's very different from being in a very stable job, where then often in many cases there's also insurance, right, against becoming disabled later on in life or during your job even. And I think there might also be a risk that then the focus is more about avoiding illness and disability, preventing that, right, rather than making society more accessible. I don't think that those tensions have to exist, but I think we need to make sure that when we use those narratives that we yeah, we kind of make sure that we don't reinforce kind of that that kind of division between people who might become disabled and people who have had that lived experience of disabled and barriers their whole lives.
Yeah, I agree with that. And the notion of our attempt to universalize disability and talk about the potential relevance to every human being, because as someone said earlier, you could just become disabled at any day. But there's also an issue of, I mean, Andy had mentioned, I think it was issues of severity, but there's also the issue of visibility. So as an untenured professor, I developed my disabilities when I was an untenured professor and I was on the job market, but they were all invisible. So I was able to hide them and spent a lot of energy and time hiding them. Not everyone can do that. Whether I would do that now, considering different changed attitudes about disability, I don't know if I would do that again, but it does, the issues of visibility are also really important to confront in terms of not just degree or severity of disability, but also in kinds of disabilities that we have. I mean, that's one of the things that I think makes disability such an overwhelming topic to tackle is, we're always talking about difference in feminism, but, the differences among, disabilities, because, every disabled person is already experiencing the differences of gender, race, class, culture. And then on top of it, there's this other difference, not just from the supposed normatively able body, but also from other kinds of disabilities. And so as a category, it becomes really difficult to get our heads wrapped around that concept. And I think that one of the advantages of thinking about the universality of disability is the ways in which, anyone who doesn't look disabled could be. And if we recognize that, any person could be disabled, could have quite serious disabilities, even though we don't see them, then that's sort of a mind shift in terms of accessibility and inclusion. And this is why, like, the standards that Barbara was talking about, I think are really important. Institutions really need to get, to understand the importance of including this sort of information. And that's where something I think where political science can really make a contribution, because I think by collecting data and developing theoretical arguments.
Oh, did she cut out?
Yeah, I think so.
We're getting pretty close to time, and I just want to kind of end on a practical note, because that's what I'm good at. That and sleeping. Just what does some of this look like going forward? So I think that some of the things that reviewing some of the options that might be available to us. And we had a conversation yesterday. Do we need a disability caucus in political science? Do we need to start moving on some of these issues to make disability studies more present in our discipline? So some things that I've done before in the gender community is smaller, more focused conferences that bring people together and that really have work products at the end of them, whereas a lot of times conferences are about discussion and nothing concrete gets done. There's also edited volumes, special issues of journals, like as concrete work outcomes that can move towards. And I think there's also funding for some of these things, right? The NSF funded a gender and political psychology conference that I hosted almost 11 years ago now. That is I think a model. I mean, I like to think it's a model for bringing people together. And we've also had spin-off groups like reading, summer reading groups where people are engaging in the same reading that brings people together to maybe introduce people to some of this critical disability studies work that they might not be familiar with, but might be applicable to their work, or even just reading about new publications in political science, some of our own work where people can really critically discuss and also move the field forward. So I guess, I would love to hear people's thoughts on sort of those practical steps that we might take. Ellen, raised her hand.
Hi there.
Mhm.
I as somebody who is mid-career and increasingly shifting her research into areas of disability, both because of professional interests and the storm of students with disabilities that I've sort of encountered and worked with, and particularly heard the stories of how other professors do or do not work with them. And then my own disabled body getting increasingly unruly over time, making things like attending conferences really hard for me. I am both 100% behind creating smaller, more localized conferences that are easier to navigate. But I desperately think we need a caucus at APSA. I mean, frankly, we should have a status committee at APSA. And I was on the status committee for LGBTQ people for a term, so that's a 3-year term, right? And we got things accomplished in that term. I think if we don't shout, no one will listen. So that's all I wanted to add to the conversation right now.
Great, thank you. Any other?
Well, I was just
Yeah, I
gonna
would
say,
have no
Mark-
idea how to do that. Yeah, go ahead, Barbara, sorry.
Oh, I just want to say, Mark Warren is coming in as president in a year's time, so it may be who would be very, very open and sympathetic to the idea of a caucus or I don't know who the current president is, but it's just worth thinking about where we might be able to, if we decide this is something we want to do, either a committee or a caucus, who would be open to that in terms of and how we would go about it.
Yeah.
I mean, I would certainly protect junior scholars from doing the labor of, I mean, I have no idea how to go about doing it either, but I'm in a better position than you are and to figure that out. Right? Like, yeah, don't volunteer for service that I mean, not that we wouldn't want voices of junior people, we would, but to use their time strategically.
We have 2 more minutes. Any final points?
Jennifer, did you want to add to that? Because that was something we talked about yesterday. So
Yeah.
I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think there's been calls for at least an affinity group within APSA for decades, and that hasn't happened. Part of it probably because of this self-selection problem of it being so hard to get into the discipline, get established. And I think that is the problem with not calling on junior faculty, is that then if it's just senior, it's just a very narrow slice. I mean, as somebody who's worked on issues of racial diversity, there's just not a whole lot of people of color, especially women of color in senior ranks. And so when you look around and you don't want to use junior people, there's no, like, you can't bring in the lived experience. I think that's just an ongoing challenge. So I don't mean it to be a Debbie Downer, but I mean, at least
No, I think that's true.
right, to share ideas at least, so that those can filter up for people who are. I love the idea of a status report.
Yeah.
So who are we volunteering to do that?
Well, okay, so my idea, I'm tenured. I'm probably a long-term associate right now.
I don't like that. I don't like to hear that. I like the idea of getting women to full professor.
Well, I'm all good. That's lovely, but part of what my disability does is make it much more difficult for me to write.
Sure.
Yeah.
Right. But I do think that the tenured folks need to throw themselves at this. And so I'm perfectly happy to be a part of a committee that takes this on.
So
I would be too. I mean, I just, unfortunately, my 3-year term on council just ended with this APSA. Otherwise I could have done something. Jennifer, I never heard anybody talk about calls for such a community. If I'd known about that, boy, I think I
Oh,
would have jumped on it.
Yeah, I don't mean it like
So
active.
I think you're right. The junior people are really, they're the people who have their pulse on what's going on the field. And so yeah, there's going to be that sort of involvement, but I'd certainly be willing to do some of the work. I could reach out to Steve Smith and Ashley Vanderbunt and just ask them, so what's required to create a status committee, or what's required to create a caucus? You certainly need a certain number of critical mass of bodies. No pun intended, but you need certain numbers of people. But I'd certainly be willing to find out at least find out what the requirements are.
Yeah, I'd be happy to help with that process as well, and to do some follow-up organizing to this panel to include people. So if you're not on the panel, but you want to be involved, why don't you just go ahead and email me, because the people who are on, I have their email addresses and spellings of their names.
I think it should be in the program. Our email should be in the program.
Oh yeah, I can put my chat too.
But
if
yes,
that's accessible. So yeah, it's great to, well, I'll let you kind of conclude, Annie.
Yeah, I don't have anything like pithy to say for the conclusion, but I just want to say, like, this is, so Monica and Stefanie and I have been sort of organizing these panels for APSA for the past 2 years, and it's wonderful to finally get to meet both of them. But I think it's been really, really fun as someone who's in a more quantitatively oriented department to also get to talk. I mean, within political theory, we have a virtual group through WPSA that's been great. But I think it's also been great to also get lines of connection with other subfields within the discipline. And so this has been really wonderful to just get multiple conversations going, because I think as much as we're doing different kinds of work, a lot of the questions are very similar of, how do we get people into the discipline? How do we get the discipline interested in what we're doing? Without, having to do these kind of pity appeals. So, or these kind of like, oh, well, you all know the ADA. So like, but I think this has been really wonderful to have this conversation. And I hope we can continue doing it, whether at APSA or at smaller conferences or whatever that looks like. So I just want to say thank you for everyone that participated, and to the audience members as well. We'd love to get you involved. We tried to put as many people, we did put as many people as we could on this panel.
We thought someone would drop out, I think.
But yes, so I just want to say thank you to everybody for sort of coming along on this ride and participating. So,
and thanks to Twitter for bringing us all together.
Yes.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Bye.